everybody. This is International Master Jesse Kraai, and today I'd like to talk about the topic of the development of a player's style. The game I'm going to be looking at is a game I played back in January 2002 in the 9th round of the U.S. Championship, and I was black here, and I was playing Dmitry Gurevich. And I recently wrote about this game and the U.S. Championships for Chess Life, and there I just gave kind of a cursory annotation of the game. But I'd like to talk a little bit deeper about the game, in particular because it strikes me that my game has changed a lot since this game was played. And I think when I thought about it, I think there was some interesting things I found in terms of the development of player styles that I think applies to everyone. And I hope this is then a useful lecture for everyone as well. Now, in a nutshell, I think style in chess is made up of the aspects of the game that we fetishize and the parts of the game that we fear. So, for example, when I played this game, I very much fetishized hyper-modern play. Okay? And now this opening I'm playing here is already an example of that. E6, B6 is called the English opening, and basically what I'm doing is I'm letting white take control of the center. And this is actually very dangerous to play this way. And in a way, hyper-modern play is the idea is letting your opponent occupy the center with pawns and then trying to attack the center with your own pieces. And if you want to know more about hypermodern play, Phil Pascal did a 3-part lecture on it, and so that could be a nice companion series to this lecture. But let's talk a little bit more about why I was doing this hypermodern play. For one, I wasn't comfortable playing, let's call them real or conventional openings. So it's like I'm hiding in the woods from my opponent here. I'm trying, to get him out of his normal rhythm. And in a way, this is kind of like a trick, to get away from the standard paths of opening theory. And part of that is simply because I didn't know enough theory. So right away, this style is a response to a given weakness that I had at that point. The other thing about this choice that's interesting is that when you play a hypermodern game like this, you're not going to get, or usually won't get, endgame play. And I think also at this point in time, my endgame play not only was was weak, but also I feared, especially psychologically, playing someone like Dmitry Gurevich, who has a very classical style. I feared him just outplaying me in the endgame. So this kind of weird style is also a response to that weakness. And the third thing is just psychologically is playing strong players. I think as a kid, I had been beaten down so much from their better understanding in normal positions that by playing strange, I am getting a chance just to get them out of their normal routine. So that's also a way in which you can see how this style of play is a reaction actually to my own weakness. Okay. Now, even though I'll be talking about the development of my own style in this lecture, simply because it's what I know best, what I'm trying to get at here is that everyone has a style, okay? That it's advantageous to reflect on one's own stylistic growth. And if you do so, in my opinion, you'll obtain a better sense of your opponent's strengths and weaknesses as well as your own. And what I would like to do now is just share with you a pregame exercise that I do. Let's say I'm playing someone and they have a certain rating. Okay? What I'll do is I'll reflect upon that rating. I'll ask myself, well, how did they get that rating? So, for example, they're going to have certain strengths and weaknesses. They're going to have certain fears, and they're going to have certain fetishes, and those are going to make up their style. If I have a sense of that, it'll help me in the course of the game. And just as a practical example, Fluffy and I were playing in a tournament in Chicago last week, and there was an interesting case where this pregame exercise really worked out. I was playing Albert Chow, who many years ago was in the 2400s and now has sunk down, I think, into the 2200s. And so in the pre-game exercise, I kind of asked myself what was going on there. And what I discovered really was thinking that he can play certain positions very well, but then psychologically he has troubles playing endgames, being active in the endgames in particular, and also playing against higher rated players. I noticed he had psychological problems just facing them. So in his game with Fluffy before me, he was offering Fluffy a draw all the time, which is really bad chess culture in itself, but it also reflected the psychological state. And even when he should have been playing for a win, he was actually playing for a draw. So the game progressed kind of the way I thought it might. He had white, and he got a very nice advantage, actually, from the opening. And this was typical of what I understood of his strengths, that he was able to play some positions very well. And then we got to an endgame where I was a little bit worse even. It was just a simple rook and king endgame. And I was worse in this endgame, and he offered a draw. And to my surprise, really, I declined it. But the point was that I realized that this was his weakness, both in terms of activity in the endgame, which I had seen in the Fluffy game, and also this willingness to take a draw when he was really a little bit better. And so I went on to win that game. And so what I'm trying to get at is by reflecting on your own style and your own weaknesses and strengths, you'll often have a better ability to see such things in your opponent's play as well. Okay, let's look at the game. My opponent played a3. I think e4 is actually much stronger, and that's why I actually had to give the opening up. After bishop b7, white can play either queen c2, which is strong, or even stronger bishop d3. And if the only way black can survive the central onslaught is to really go for it with f5, but after e takes, you can even win a rook, but it's going to become a real mess. This is a known position here. And we could analyze this position. Maybe in a future lecture I'll analyze this position a little bit more in depth. But the point will be simply that white's pieces are too active, and he's going to get mated. So, let's go back. So in this game, my opponent was a classical player, and he played a classical move a3, bishop b7, knight c3. So the pawn on a3 prevents me from playing bishop to b4. And here I made another decision that I think is indicative of my style at that time. Normal would be knight f6, and this would transpose into a Petrosian a3 variation of the Queen's Indian. But again, I wasn't willing to go into these main lines, and so I played this move f5. So I'm controlling the center with f5, but I'm also critically weakening my king's position for the rest of the game. So again, it's kind of like an odd decision. My opponent plays d5. He wants to shut down this bishop here on b7. Knight f6, g3, knight a6, bishop g2, knight c5, knight h3, bishop d6, castles, bishop e5. Okay, so let's take stock. This position I think is completely playable for black, but notice how it's very hyper-modern in nature. White really is controlling the center with his pawns, but black is trying to control the center with his minor pieces. And here he attains a very paradoxical setup, an unusual setup of his minor pieces in the center. And this was typical at the time of what I fetishized about my hypermodern play, is that I was very interested in how Nimzovich played, and I think Nimzovich would be proud of this type of weird position. Okay, queen c2, castles, d1, queen e7. Okay, now my opponent played rook b1, which is a little bit strange. Probably bishop e3 is the best move. We just get a fighting game. But he plays rook b1, and so his idea is he wants to knock me out with b4, knock my knight out of play. And here again, I made a very interesting decision that I think reflects my style at the time. Probably the best move is just to play rook a e8, gaining central space. But what I did was I made this really strange decision to play bishop takes, queen takes, pawn takes, pawn takes, queen takes, pawn. Now, let's talk about this for a second. So I win a pawn, and I win a central pawn. But it's really kind of a weird decision, because the central pawn in itself, at this stage of the game, isn't really contributing to White's control of the center. Okay? But in my kind of philosophy at this point in time, I really valued central pawns, simply because I had read so much Nimzowitsch. And so I win this pawn, and my pieces, I get rid of my best bishop. My pieces are going to become discoordinated. White's going to gain several tempi. And while I still think this position is playable for black, the point is that during the game I thought maybe I was better, and I think that's just ridiculous, even if the computer now would say I'm better, simply because all of White's pieces are going to be very active now, and I still haven't solved my biggest problem, which is my bishop on b7. Okay, bishop e3 was played, knight e4, queen d4, knight d6, so now I'm threatening maybe to play queen c4, and my opponent b3. I bring the queen back, and now he kicks me, now because there's no queen c4 threat. He touches my pawn. a4, queen f7, knight f4. So let's think about this position. I still think it's probably unclear, but what's interesting in looking back on it is this central pawn that I have, the extra central pawn, isn't all that useful. I mean, all that decisive. It's definitely important, but it's not decisive. White has the two bishops. All of his pieces are good. He has more space. So I'd say here simply that White has good compensation, whereas at the time I thought black was better. fd8, a5, bishop a6, simply queen a1, bishop c4, and here it really was only now that my opponent made the critical mistake. I think that with the move simply bishop d4, putting pressure all over the board, he would retain fine compensation. No reason to think otherwise. And so what that shows a little bit was my prejudice with the extra center pawn. I thought somehow I'd be better, but even if the computer thinks I'm better here, I don't really agree. White has fantastic coordination of pieces. Okay, so he played f3. Now, you can imagine, though, we're in this paradoxical position, and time trouble mistakes are going to happen. And I remember this was a mild time pressure decision on Gurevich's part. So f3 is just bad because it blocks the bishop on g2, which was so beautiful, and it really opens up White's king. And White's better king position was one of the main pieces of compensation he had in the position. And now I'm going to be better here, because after knight f6 we get kind of a forced variation. Bishop d4, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, bishop takes g7, and now black has a desperado with bishop takes f3. Bishop takes f3, queen g7, and now I think black's winning. But notice, just the type of the position is still indicative of the style I had then, where these pawns are really funny. That was the other thing. The other Nimzowitsch idea is not to move the central pawns, and thereby giving yourself somehow flexibility. Though in this case, I don't even understand what I'm talking about in that case, because the pawns simply can't really move at the moment anyway. And leaving them behind where they still have the option of moving one or two squares, at least in this position, really gives me no great benefit. So, check, king h8, he trades the pawns, rook d5, and now it's kind of, it's reasonably simple for black, simply because White has no fantastic plan, and he's just down 2 pawns, and also his king is just as open as mine is. Rook d4, d6, now mistake, bishop d5, and I'm able to play rook e2. So if the queen takes the rook, I'll take his rook on d4, winning the bishop on d5. Queen d3, rook e8, rook f4, queen b2. And so I've now penetrated into the position. Rook takes c7, rook d2, and I'm going to win the bishop. White plays a couple more moves. Time pressure. I win the bishop. Takes d7, queen c3, rook h4 is the last move of time pressure, and here before I played my move, my opponent resigns simply because rook e1 is coming. Okay, so I won this game, and what's funny about winning the game like this is then you feel validated in these weird chess beliefs that you have, and I think every player has games like that, because of course you're going to win sometimes, and even this weird hyper-modern style has its advantages. In particular, it got my opponent out of his normal way of thinking. Okay, so I'd like to conclude here with a final thought about chess style that I hope really brings out some of the things I'm trying to get after here. And what I'd like us to think about is that music has many similarities to chess. So, for example, you see the development of style also in composers and musicians. But see, to my mind, chess has a key advantage over music. And that is that our progress can be objectively measured. So, for example, no matter how much progress I think I've made since this game, it all comes down to, let's say, 50 or so FIDE rating points. Okay? But a musician, right, lacks this objective measure, and he'll be able to delude himself into thinking that he's some kind of genius. Right? Whereas in chess, we always have this objective measure that basically tells us where we stand in terms of our own chess development. And this brings me to the point I really want to make here. A simple evolvement of your chess style will in itself, just all by itself, not bring you any progress. That's what I believe. But a reflection upon your chess style will enable you to think, I think, about where you are weak and where you need improvement. So, for example, in this game, what we see is that I was worried about mainline openings. I didn't feel I had enough experience, so I'm hiding in this hyper-modern style. I'm also afraid of endgame play. And we also see there's some weird psychological things going on where I'm afraid of playing my opponent where he is perhaps strongest, right, in some kind of conventional game. So I try to make things weird. Okay? And I can assure you, I've lost far more games against GMs playing this type of way than I've won. And I think that the progress that was actually made was thinking about my chess style and then trying to make improvements, not necessarily my chess style itself changing. Okay, so the improvements I made, for example, was learning some decent openings, for example, might help. Learning better endgame technique might help. And also going over my own games gives me a sense of psychologically what's going on in these kinds of encounters. For example, in the Chow example that we had earlier, going over one's games would give a person like that the self-awareness of where one's psychologically weak, and then in order to make improvement, you really have to conquer those psychological fears. And that's where I think when you reflect upon chess style, that you can really improve your game by recognizing your own weaknesses and changing them. So, this is International Master Jesse Kraai, hoping you've enjoyed this little step into the thoughts on chess style. Bye-bye.